My fiancé and his parents publicly humiliated my late father at our rehearsal dinner, so I called off the wedding without a second thought. I'm 31 years old, and until recently, I was engaged to Marcus, a man I genuinely believed would be my forever person. But before I dive into this complete story, let me know where you're tuning in from. If you're enjoying these real-life stories and want to hear more like this every day, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Your support means the world to me, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. I met Marcus about 5 years ago at a charity fundraiser in downtown Seattle. He was volunteering at the silent auction table, had this infectious laugh, and we instantly connected over our shared love of hiking and terrible dad jokes. When he proposed last spring during a weekend trip to Mount Rainier, it felt like everything in my life was finally falling into place. The ring was simple but perfect, and the way he got down on one knee overlooking the valley made my heart soar. At the time, I thought I wasn't just marrying Marcus, I was gaining a whole new family. His parents, Richard and Catherine, were the type of people who commanded attention wherever they went. Richard owned a successful law firm in Bellevue, and Catherine was heavily involved in various social committees around the city. They were sophisticated, well-connected, and always seemed to have opinions about everything and everyone. Initially, I found their confidence charming, but over time I began to see how their sense of superiority affected every interaction they had. Before I get deeper into what went wrong, I need to tell you about my dad, David. He was the most genuine, hardworking man I've ever known. He passed away 3 years ago, after a sudden heart attack, and not a day goes by that I don't miss his wisdom and warmth. Dad was a contractor who built homes for working families in our neighborhood of Tacoma. He wasn't wealthy or famous, but he had this incredible ability to see when people needed help and quietly step in without making them feel embarrassed about it. My father was everyone's rock, including Marcus's family, though you'd never know it by how they talked about him later. When I first introduced Marcus to Dad, they got along wonderfully. Dad saw how happy Marcus made me, and that was enough for him. Marcus seemed respectful and kind, and Dad told me privately that he approved. "He's got good character, sweetheart," he said. "That's what matters." But as Marcus and I got more serious, I started noticing some tension. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just small comments here and there. Marcus would sometimes refer to my dad as old-fashioned, or mention how different our backgrounds were. When I pressed him about it, he'd brush it off, saying he was just adjusting to being part of a simpler family. That word simpler always bothered me, but I convinced myself he didn't mean it the way it sounded. The thing is, my dad had done so much for Marcus's family over the years, and they barely acknowledged it. About 4 years ago, when Richard and Catherine were renovating their kitchen in their Mercer Island home, they were having problems with their contractor. The work was shoddy, deadlines were missed, and they were facing a potential lawsuit. Dad stepped in and spent weekends fixing the electrical work and plumbing issues, refusing to take any payment beyond the cost of materials. "Neighbors help neighbors," he said, even though they lived 40 minutes away. Then there was the time Catherine's elderly mother needed her bathroom made accessible after a hip surgery. Dad showed up with his tools and spent 3 days installing grab bars, a walk-in shower, and non-slip flooring. He did it all for free, because Catherine mentioned offhandedly that they couldn't find anyone reliable to do the work quickly. Dad never hesitated to help people, especially when it came to safety issues. Marcus's younger sister, Jennifer, was struggling to afford repairs on her first apartment when her ceiling started leaking. Dad not only fixed the roof issue, but also repainted the damaged areas and helped her negotiate with her landlord about covering the costs. He spent his own money on supplies and his free time making sure she had a safe place to live. But perhaps the most significant thing Dad did was help Richard during a particularly difficult period in his law practice. Richard had made some bad investments and was facing serious financial pressure. Dad co-signed a business loan that allowed Richard to keep his firm afloat during those tough months. Without that loan, Richard might have lost everything he'd worked for. Dad took on that risk because he believed families should support each other, even when that family was still just potential in-laws. Looking back, I realize how little gratitude Richard and Catherine showed for everything Dad did. They'd say thanks in passing, but there was never any real acknowledgement of the sacrifices he made or the risks he took to help them. Dad never expected recognition. That wasn't who he was. But their casual dismissal of his generosity should have been a red flag. When Dad passed away suddenly from his heart attack, I was devastated. He was only 58, and we'd had no warning. One day we were planning to go fishing that weekend, and the next day I was planning his funeral. Marcus was there for me during those dark weeks, or at least I thought he was. Looking back, I can see that his support felt perfunctory, like he was going through the motions of being a caring fiancé, without really understanding the depth of my grief. The signs of what was to come started showing up during our wedding planning. The warning signs during our wedding planning should have been impossible to ignore, but love has a way of making you blind to things you don't want to see. Marcus started showing his true colors in subtle ways that I kept excusing or rationalizing away. It began with small comments about my dad whenever I brought him up in conversations about the ceremony. I wanted to include a memorial tribute during our vows, maybe a moment of silence or a dedication in the program. Marcus would immediately shut down these ideas, saying things like, "Don't you think that'll make everyone sad? Weddings are supposed to be celebrations, not funerals." When I suggested having Dad's favorite song played during the reception, Marcus rolled his eyes and said, "Do we really need to turn this into a memorial service, Sarah?" Each dismissal felt like a small stab to my heart, but I kept telling myself that Marcus was just trying to keep our wedding day positive. I convinced myself that maybe he was right. Maybe I was being too sentimental. But deep down, I knew that honoring my father's memory wasn't about dwelling on sadness. It was about celebrating the man who raised me and acknowledging his influence on who I'd become. The comments from Richard and Catherine became more frequent and cutting as the wedding approached. Richard had this way of making jokes that weren't really jokes. They were thinly veiled insults designed to remind me of my place in their social hierarchy. During one dinner at their house, he raised his wine glass and said, "Here's to Marcus marrying for love instead of status. Not everyone can say that." The way he looked at me when he said it made it clear that he saw me as beneath their family's standards. Catherine was even more direct with her passive-aggressive remarks. She'd say things like, "Well, we all make compromises when we fall in love," while looking pointedly at me. Or she'd comment on how refreshing it was that Marcus was staying grounded by marrying someone from a working-class background. The way she said working class made it sound like a character flaw rather than something to be proud of. What hurt the most was Marcus's reaction to these comments, or rather, his lack of reaction. He'd either laugh along with his parents or simply ignore their jabs entirely. When I tried to bring it up with him privately, he'd wave off my concerns and say I was being too sensitive or reading too much into things. He'd tell me that his parents were just adjusting to having me in the family and that I needed to give them time. But time only made things worse. Richard and Catherine seemed to grow more comfortable with their subtle cruelty as the wedding date approached. They'd make comments about how different our families' traditions were, always emphasizing the word like it was code for something lesser. Catherine once suggested that we have the wedding reception at their country club instead of the community center Dad and I had loved in Tacoma. "It's just more appropriate for our social circle," she said with that fake sweet smile of hers. The breaking point came about 6 weeks before the wedding, during a particularly tense dinner at their house. We were discussing seating arrangements when I mentioned wanting to save a seat in the front row for Dad's memory, an empty chair with a small photo and some of his favorite flowers. The room went dead silent. Richard cleared his throat and said, "Don't you think that's a bit dramatic? I mean, he's gone, Sarah. We can't keep living in the past." Catherine nodded in agreement, adding, "Yes, dear, weddings are about looking forward, not backward. Perhaps we could find a more subtle way to acknowledge him if you absolutely insist." I felt my face flush with anger and hurt. "He wasn't just anyone," I said, my voice shaking. "He was my father, the most important man in my life before Marcus. He deserves to be honored at my wedding." Richard leaned back in his chair with that condescending expression I'd grown to hate. "Of course he was important to you, Sarah. But let's be realistic here. David was a nice enough man, but he was also quite involved in things that weren't necessarily his business. What's that supposed to mean? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Catherine jumped in with her explanation. Well, he did have a tendency to insert himself into situations, didn't he? Always offering to help with things that other people probably would have preferred to handle privately. She exchanged a meaningful glance with Richard. Some people might call that generous, but others might find it a bit presumptuous. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were talking about my father's kindness and generosity like they were character flaws. This was the same man who had saved Richard's business, renovated Catherine's mother's bathroom, and spent countless hours helping their family without ever asking for anything in return. Presumptuous? I repeated, my voice rising. He helped you when no one else would. He co-signed that loan for your practice, Richard, when the banks turned you down. He spent his weekends fixing your kitchen renovation disaster. How is helping your family presumptuous? Richard's jaw tightened. And we appreciated it, of course. But there's a difference between helping when asked and constantly inserting yourself into other people's business. Your father had a habit of assuming people needed his help when they might have preferred to handle things themselves. Marcus finally spoke up, but not in the way I'd hoped. Sarah, they're not trying to insult your dad. They're just saying he was very hands-on. Maybe we should focus on planning our future instead of relitigating the past. That word, relitigating, hit me like a slap. He was talking about my father's memory like it was a legal dispute, rather than something precious and sacred to me. In that moment, I realized that Marcus had been listening to his parents' poisonous opinions about my dad for who knows how long, and instead of defending the man who had helped his family so much, he was siding with them. I excused myself from dinner that night, claiming I had a headache, but really I just needed to get away from their toxic attitudes before I said something I'd regret. Marcus barely seemed to notice when I left early, too caught up in discussing golf plans with his father. That night, lying in bed in my small apartment in Tacoma, the same neighborhood where Dad had lived his whole adult life, I started seriously questioning whether I was making the right choice. The man I'd fallen in love with seemed to be disappearing, replaced by someone who cared more about his parents' approval than about defending our relationship or honoring my family's memory. But I pushed those doubts away, telling myself that once we were married and had our own space, things would be different. I convinced myself that Marcus would find his backbone once he didn't have to live under his parents' constant influence. I told myself that Richard and Catherine would eventually warm up to me once they saw how happy I made their son. Looking back now, I realize I was making excuses for behavior that should have been unacceptable from the very beginning. I was so invested in the idea of our future together that I ignored all the evidence showing me who Marcus and his family really were. The rehearsal dinner was still 3 weeks away, but the foundation for that disaster was already being laid with every dismissive comment, every cruel joke, and every moment Marcus chose his parents' approval over defending the woman he claimed to love. 3 weeks before our wedding, Richard and Catherine made an announcement that should have thrilled me, but instead filled me with a sense of dread. They offered to host our rehearsal dinner at the Metropolitan, one of Seattle's most exclusive restaurants overlooking Elliott Bay. On the surface, it seemed like a generous gesture, the kind of thing that might signal they were finally ready to accept me into their family. We've already spoken with the event coordinator, Catherine announced during our weekly wedding planning meeting at their house. The private dining room has the most stunning view of the Sound, and the chef is willing to create a custom menu just for us. She said this with the air of someone bestowing a great honor, like she was doing us the favor of a lifetime. Richard nodded importantly. It's not easy to get reservations there, especially for a private event, but we have connections, and we want this to be perfect for you both. The way he emphasized connections made it clear this was as much about showing off their social status as it was about celebrating our upcoming marriage. At first, I tried to be grateful. The Metropolitan was undeniably impressive, the kind of place where Seattle's elite went to see and be seen. Dad would have been amazed by the crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd probably have joked about feeling underdressed even in his best suit. But as I sat there listening to Catherine go on about the caliber of venue they'd secured for us, I couldn't shake the feeling that this dinner was going to be more about them than about Marcus and me. "We'll handle all the details," Catherine continued, waving her hand dismissively when I started to ask about the guest list. "You two just need to show up and look happy. We want this to be a night no one will ever forget." Something about the way she said that last part sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Over the next few days, every conversation with Richard and Catherine somehow circled back to the rehearsal dinner. They talked about it constantly. The exclusive venue, the custom menu, the carefully curated wine selection. Catherine kept mentioning how much effort and expense they were putting into making the evening special, as if she wanted to make sure I understood the magnitude of their generosity. "The chef is flying in fresh seafood from Alaska," she told me during one of our phone calls. "Nothing but the best for our Mackenzie's rehearsal dinner." Though I suppose it's quite different from what your family might be used to. There it was again, that subtle dig wrapped up in fake sweetness. Richard was even more explicit about his expectations. During a lunch meeting to discuss final wedding details, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, Sarah, this dinner is going to be attended by some very important people. Business associates, family friends, members of our social circle. I trust you understand how significant this is for Marcus's future." The implication was clear. I needed to be on my best behavior and not embarrass them in front of their important guests. As the date approached, I started getting more details about who would actually be attending this dinner that was supposedly in our honor. The guest list had somehow ballooned to include Richard's law partners, Catherine's committee friends, and various business connections. Meanwhile, my side of the family consisted of just 5 people. My older brother Jake, my Aunt Linda, my 2 closest friends from college, and my dad's best friend Tom, who had been like an uncle to me growing up. When I questioned Marcus about the lopsided guest list, he gave me that same dismissive response I'd grown tired of hearing. "My parents know a lot of people, Sarah. They want to share our happiness with their community. Isn't that nice?" "But it doesn't feel like our rehearsal dinner," I protested. "It feels like a networking event for your parents." Marcus sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Can't you just appreciate what they're doing for us? Do you know how much a dinner at the Metropolitan costs? They're spending a fortune on this." That response told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. It wasn't about celebrating our relationship or bringing our families together. It was about impressing his parents, social circle, and showing off their wealth and connections. The week before the dinner, Catherine called me with what she described as exciting news about the evening's program. "Richard and I have prepared some special remarks for the dinner," she said in that sugar-sweet voice that never failed to put me on edge. "We want to properly welcome you to the family and share some thoughts about marriage and commitment." My stomach dropped. "What kind of remarks?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Oh, just some heartfelt words about love and family values," Catherine replied vaguely. "Richard has some wonderful stories to share, and I thought I might say a few words about the importance of choosing the right partner in life." The way she said "right partner" made my skin crawl. I had a terrible feeling that their heartfelt remarks were going to be anything but heartfelt, at least toward me. But when I tried to discuss my concerns with Marcus, he brushed them off as usual. "They're trying to be inclusive," he insisted. "They want to make you feel like part of the family. Why can't you see that?" But I wasn't feeling included at all. I was feeling like an outsider at my own rehearsal dinner, like a prop in Richard and Catherine's elaborate show of social superiority. Every detail they shared about the evening, from the imported flowers to the string quartet, felt designed to emphasize the gulf between their world and mine. 3 days before the dinner, I had a moment of clarity while looking through old photos of Dad. There was one picture I loved of him in his work clothes, grinning proudly in front of a house he'd just finished building for a young family. His hands were dirty. His shirt was stained with paint, but his smile was pure joy. He'd spent months on that project, often working late into the evening to make sure every detail was perfect, and he'd charged the family barely enough to cover his materials because he knew they were struggling financially. That was who my father was, a man who found genuine happiness in helping others, who measured success not by the size of his bank account, but by the positive impact he had on people's lives. Richard and Catherine lived in a completely different world, one where worth was measured by social connections and expensive dinners at exclusive restaurants. As I stared at that photo, I realized I was about to sit through an evening where my father's memory would likely be either ignored completely or, worse, subtly mocked by people who had benefited enormously from his generosity, but had never truly respected him. But I still held on to hope that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong about their intentions. Maybe the dinner would go smoothly, and I could finally start building a genuine relationship with Marcus's family. Maybe they really were trying to welcome me, and all my anxieties were just pre-wedding jitters. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was being. The signs were all there: the exclusive guest list that marginalized my family, the emphasis on impressing their social circle, the vague mentions of special remarks that filled me with dread. I should have trusted my instincts and demanded more information about what Richard and Catherine were planning to say. Instead, I chose to hope for the best while preparing for the worst, not knowing that the worst would be far more devastating than I could have ever imagined. The night of the rehearsal dinner arrived with Seattle's typical October drizzle, and I should have taken it as an omen. Marcus picked me up from my apartment in Tacoma, and I could tell he was nervous about something, though he claimed it was just normal pre-wedding jitters. He kept checking his phone and adjusting his tie, barely making conversation during our drive to the Metropolitan. "You look beautiful," he said absently as we pulled into the restaurant's valet area, but his eyes were already scanning the entrance for his parents. That should have been my first clue about where his priorities lay that evening. The Metropolitan was every bit as intimidating as I'd expected. The maître d' greeted us like we were royalty, and I felt completely out of place in my simple black dress among all the designer gowns and expensive suits. Richard and Catherine were already holding court near the private dining room entrance, air-kissing their guests, and making introductions like they were hosting a charity gala rather than their son's rehearsal dinner. "Sarah, darling," Catherine called out when she spotted us, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You look lovely. Very appropriate." The way she said appropriate made it clear she meant it as faint praise at best. Richard was busy glad-handing a group of men in expensive suits, his law partners and business associates, I assumed. He barely acknowledged my arrival with a quick nod before returning to his conversation about market trends and investment opportunities. This was supposed to be about celebrating Marcus and me, but it felt more like a corporate networking event. As we made our way into the dining room, I was struck by how few familiar faces I saw. My small group, Jake, Aunt Linda, my friends Emma and Jessica, and Dad's friend Tom, looked as out of place as I felt among Richard and Catherine's social circle. Tom, in particular, looked uncomfortable in his ill-fitting suit, though he'd made an effort to dress up for the occasion. He'd been Dad's closest friend for over 20 years, and seeing him trying so hard to fit in made my heart ache. The seating arrangement told its own story. Richard and Catherine had positioned themselves at the head of the long table, with Marcus and me to Richard's right. My family and friends were scattered throughout the middle and far end of the table, mixed in with Richard's colleagues and Catherine's committee friends. It was clearly designed to minimize our presence rather than celebrate the joining of two families. Dinner conversation was stilted and awkward. Richard's business associates dominated most of the discussion, talking about cases and investments that had nothing to do with our wedding or relationship. Catherine held court with her social circle, discussing upcoming charity events and mutual acquaintances. Meanwhile, my small group tried their best to engage with the strangers around them, though it was clear they felt as uncomfortable as I did. Marcus seemed oblivious to the tension, or maybe he was just choosing to ignore it. He laughed at his father's jokes, even the ones that weren't particularly funny, and made polite small talk with his mother's friends. When I tried to catch his eye to share a meaningful look or connect with him somehow, he was always looking elsewhere, focused on impressing his parents, guests. After the main course was cleared away, Richard stood up and tapped his wine glass with his knife. The room gradually fell silent, and I felt my stomach clench with anxiety. This was the moment Catherine had mentioned the special remarks they'd prepared for the evening. "Good evening, everyone," Richard began, his voice carrying the authority he used in courtrooms. Catherine and I want to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Marcus and Sarah as they prepare to begin their marriage tomorrow. So far, so good. Maybe I'd been worrying for nothing. As most of you know, Marcus has always been our pride and joy. Richard continued, beaming at his son. He's accomplished everything we could have hoped for. Harvard Law, a position at Preston and Associates, and now he's found someone who will help keep him grounded in the important things in life. The way he said grounded made it sound like I was an anchor dragging Marcus down rather than a partner lifting him up. I glanced at Marcus, hoping he'd caught the subtle insult, but he was smiling proudly at his father's words. Sarah comes from a very different background than we're used to, Richard went on, and I felt my face flush. Her father was a contractor, a hard-working man who believed in helping his neighbors. Some might say he was perhaps a little too eager to help, even when his assistance wasn't necessarily requested. My blood ran cold. He was already starting to disparage Dad's memory, and we were barely 2 minutes into his speech. I looked around the table and saw Tom's jaw tighten. Jake was staring at Richard with undisguised anger, but Marcus was still smiling, apparently oblivious to the insult his father had just delivered. Richard raised his glass slightly, but David certainly was generous with his time and resources. Perhaps overly generous, some might say. He had a tendency to insert himself into situations that other people might have preferred to handle privately. The room was dead quiet now. Even Richard's business associates seemed uncomfortable with the direction this speech was taking. Catherine was nodding along approvingly, that same fake sweet smile plastered on her face. For instance, Richard continued, warming to his theme, when we were having some work done on our kitchen a few years ago, David insisted on getting involved, even though we hadn't asked for his help. He spent weekends at our house, fixing problems that we probably could have handled through proper channels. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Dad had saved their kitchen renovation after their contractor botched the job and threatened to sue them. He'd donated his time and expertise to help them avoid a lawsuit and financial disaster, and now Richard was portraying it as unwanted meddling. And then there was the business loan, Richard said, his tone becoming more condescending. David co-signed a rather significant loan for my practice during a difficult period. While we appreciated the gesture, it did put us in the somewhat awkward position of being financially obligated to Sarah's family. The way he said obligated made it sound like Dad had manipulated them into accepting his help rather than generously offering assistance when they desperately needed it. I felt tears of anger burning behind my eyes, but I forced myself to stay seated and keep quiet. Richard wasn't finished. David also had some very strong opinions about how things should be done. He was the type of man who always knew what was best for everyone else, whether they asked for his advice or not. That was when Catherine stood up, clearly ready to add her own commentary to this character assassination of my father. "Oh yes," she said with a light laugh. "David definitely had his own way of doing things. He was very hands-on, wasn't he?" Several of their friends chuckled politely, though I could see some of them looking uncomfortable with the direction this was going. My family members were sitting in stunned silence, unsure how to react to this public humiliation. "But we want to be clear," Catherine continued. "We're grateful for everything David did for our family, even if his methods were sometimes a bit presumptuous." She smiled directly at me when she said that word, making sure I understood that this was personal. Richard nodded sagely. "Yes, presumptuous is a good word for it. David had a habit of assuming people needed his help when they might have preferred to solve their problems independently. I felt like I was going to be sick. They were systematically destroying my father's reputation in front of a room full of people, portraying his kindness and generosity as character flaws. And Marcus was just sitting there, letting it happen. But enough about the past, Richard said, raising his glass higher. Tonight is about looking forward to Marcus and Sarah's future together. Let's hope Sarah has inherited her father's generous spirit without his tendency to over-involve himself in other people's affairs. The final insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Richard was essentially saying he hoped I wouldn't be as meddlesome as my father had been, conveniently forgetting that my father's meddling had saved their business, their home renovations, and their family's financial stability multiple times. A few people raised their glasses half-heartedly, clearly sensing that something had gone very wrong with this toast. But most of the room sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure how to respond to what they'd just witnessed. I looked at Marcus desperately, waiting for him to stand up and defend my father's memory, to set the record straight about what kind of man Dad really was. But Marcus just sat there, glass raised, smiling at his father like he'd just delivered a heartwarming tribute instead of a cruel character assassination. That's when I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. The silence in the room was deafening after Richard's cruel toast. I could feel my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. My hands were trembling with rage, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Around me, I could see the shocked faces of my small family group. Jake's knuckles were white as he clenched his fists, Tom looked like he wanted to leap across the table, and Aunt Linda had tears in her eyes. But what broke my heart most was Marcus. He was still sitting there with that same pleasant smile, completely oblivious to the fact that his father had just publicly humiliated the memory of the man who had raised me and helped his family more than they deserved. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor in the sudden quiet. Every eye in the room turned to me, but I didn't care. I couldn't sit there for one more second and let them destroy my father's memory without consequences. "Are you serious right now?" I said, my voice low but shaking with anger. I was looking directly at Richard, who seemed genuinely surprised that I had the audacity to interrupt his moment. Catherine immediately tried to smooth things over with her fake sweetness. "Oh, Sarah dear, please don't be upset. We were just sharing some fond memories of your father." "Fond memories?" I repeated, my voice getting louder. "You just spent 10 minutes trashing the man who saved your business, fixed your house, and helped your family when no one else would. You called him presumptuous and meddlesome. How exactly is that fond?" Richard leaned back in his chair, clearly annoyed that I was challenging him in front of his important guests. "Sarah, I think you're misunderstanding our intent here. We were simply acknowledging that David had a very hands-on approach to helping people." "Hands-on?" I shot back. "He was generous. He was kind. He saw people in need and he helped them without expecting anything in return. And this is how you repay that generosity? By mocking him at my rehearsal dinner?" The room was completely silent now, except for my voice. I could see some of Richard's business associates shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. But I was beyond caring about their comfort. Marcus finally spoke up, but not in the way I desperately hoped he would. "Sarah, please sit down. You're making a scene." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Making a scene? His parents had just spent the last 15 minutes systematically destroying my father's character in front of a room full of people, and he was worried about me making a scene? "I'm making a scene?" I said, turning to face him directly. "Marcus, they just called my father presumptuous for helping your family. They made it sound like he forced his assistance on you, when the truth is he saved your parents from financial ruin." Richard stood up now, clearly deciding he needed to regain control of the situation. "That's quite enough," he said in his authoritative lawyer voice. "Sarah, I understand you're emotional, but this is neither the time nor the place for this kind of outburst." "Outburst?" I laughed bitterly. "You think defending my father's memory is an outburst? Let me tell you what an outburst really looks like." I turned to face the entire room, no longer caring about making anyone comfortable. Since Richard seems to have forgotten, let me remind everyone exactly what my father did for this family. 4 years ago, when their kitchen renovation was botched and they were facing a lawsuit, my dad spent 3 weekends of his own time fixing electrical and plumbing problems that could have cost them thousands of dollars. He refused to take any payment beyond materials. Richard's face was turning red, but I kept going. When Catherine's mother needed her bathroom made accessible after surgery, my dad spent 3 days installing safety features for free because he was worried about an elderly woman's safety. And when their younger daughter Jennifer needed roof repairs she couldn't afford, my dad not only fixed the leak but painted the damaged areas and helped her negotiate with her landlord. I could see some of the guests looking back and forth between Richard and me, starting to understand that there were 2 very different versions of these events. "But the biggest thing my father did," I continued, my voice getting stronger, was co-sign a business loan for Richard's law practice when he was facing serious financial trouble. My dad took on that risk because he believed family should help family, even when that family was just potential in-laws at the time. Richard opened his mouth to interrupt, but I held up my hand. Without that loan, Richard, you might have lost everything. Your practice, your reputation, maybe even this fancy lifestyle you're so proud of. My father made that possible, and he never once asked for recognition or special treatment. He never held it over your head or expected anything in return. The room was dead silent. I could see Tom nodding along with my words, and Jake was watching Richard with undisguised contempt. So when you stand up here and call him presumptuous and meddlesome, I said, my voice cracking with emotion, what you're really saying is that you're ungrateful. You took everything my father offered, benefited from his generosity for years, and now you want to rewrite history to make him sound like some kind of busybody who forced his help on you. Catherine tried to interject. Sarah, dear, we never meant. Yes, you did. I cut her off. You meant every word of it. This whole dinner, this whole speech, was designed to put me in my place and make sure everyone here knows that I'm not good enough for your precious son. I turned back to Marcus, who was staring at me with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. And you, I said, pointing at him. You just sat there and let them do it. You didn't say one word to defend my father or correct their lies. You were more worried about impressing your parents, friends, than protecting the memory of the man who helped make your family's success possible. Marcus finally found his voice. Sarah, you need to calm down. Everyone is staring. Let them stare, I said. I'm tired of pretending this is okay. I'm tired of letting your family treat me like I'm some charity case who should be grateful for their attention. And I'm really tired of being with someone who won't stand up for me when it matters most. Richard decided to reassert his authority. This is completely inappropriate behavior for a family gathering. Sarah, I think you should leave and come back when you can conduct yourself appropriately. Oh, I'm leaving, I said, grabbing my purse from the back of my chair. But not because you told me to. I'm leaving because I finally understand what kind of people you really are. I started walking toward the door, but then I stopped and turned back to face the room one more time. For anyone who's wondering, I said, addressing the entire dinner party, my father was the most honorable man I've ever known. He helped people because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected anything in return. He taught me that character isn't measured by how much money you have or which restaurants you can get reservations at. It's measured by how you treat people when they need help and how you honor the people who help you. I looked directly at Richard and Catherine. My father had more character in his little finger than you two have in your entire bodies. And Marcus, I turned to my fiancé. The fact that you can sit there and let them trash his memory tells me everything I need to know about your character too. With that, I walked toward the door. Behind me, I could hear the scraping of chairs as Jake, Tom, Aunt Linda, and my friends stood up to follow me. At least my real family knew how to show loyalty when it mattered. As I reached the door, I heard Marcus call out, Sarah, wait, don't leave like this. I paused with my hand on the door handle. For just a moment, I hoped he was finally going to do the right thing, that he was going to choose me over his parents. Approval. But when I turned around, he was still sitting at that table, looking more concerned about the scene I was making than about what had driven me to make it. I'm not the one who should be leaving, I said quietly. I'm not the one who should be ashamed of how I acted tonight. And with that, I walked out of the Metropolitan, my real family behind me, leaving Marcus to explain to his parents, social circle, why his fiancée had just exposed their cruelty for everyone to see. Outside the Metropolitan, the Seattle drizzle had turned into a steady rain, but I barely noticed as I stood on the sidewalk trying to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking from adrenaline, and I felt like I might collapse from the emotional weight of what had just happened. Jake immediately put his arm around me, while Tom was pacing back and forth, muttering angrily under his breath about Richard and Catherine. Sarah, honey, are you okay? Aunt Linda asked, her voice full of concern. She looked as shaken as I felt. Seeing her brother's memory attacked like that had clearly devastated her too. I can't believe they said those things about Dad, I managed to say through the tears that were finally starting to flow. After everything he did for them, they turned him into some kind of villain. Tom stopped pacing and came over to me. "Your father was the finest man I ever knew," he said, his voice thick with emotion. What they said in there was disgusting. David helped people because that's who he was, not because he wanted to control anybody. Emma and Jessica flanked me on either side, offering silent support while Jake flagged down a taxi. "Let's get you home," he said gently. "You don't need to be standing out here in the rain." As we waited for the cab, I kept glancing back at the restaurant entrance, some small part of me hoping that Marcus would come running after me, ready to apologize and make things right. But the minutes ticked by, and the only people coming out of the Metropolitan were other diners who had nothing to do with our disaster of a rehearsal dinner. The ride back to my apartment was quiet, except for the occasional supportive comment from my family and friends. But my mind was racing, replaying every moment of that horrific evening. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, not just at Richard and Catherine, but at Marcus for his complete failure to defend me or my father's memory. Back at my apartment, we all sat in my small living room, still processing what had happened. Jake made coffee while the others tried to comfort me, but I felt numb. Tomorrow was supposed to be my wedding day, and instead I was sitting here wondering how I could have been so blind to who Marcus really was. "You did the right thing in there," Tom said firmly. "Your dad would have been proud of how you stood up for him." "But what am I supposed to do now?" I asked, feeling lost. "The wedding is tomorrow. The church is booked. The flowers are ordered. Everyone's expecting." "Sarah," Jake interrupted gently, "after what happened tonight, do you really want to marry Marcus?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Deep down, I knew the answer, but saying it out loud would make it real. It would mean admitting that the last 5 years of my life had been leading to this moment of complete clarity about who Marcus truly was. My phone had been buzzing constantly since we left the restaurant. Text after text from Marcus, a few from Catherine, and even some from Richard. I finally looked at them, hoping against hope that at least one would contain a genuine apology or acknowledgement of what they'd done wrong. Marcus's messages ranged from confused to frustrated. "Why did you leave like that? You embarrassed me in front of everyone. We need to talk before tomorrow. My parents are upset, but they didn't mean anything by it." Catherine's were more manipulative. "I'm so sorry you misunderstood our intentions tonight. We love you like a daughter. Please don't let emotions ruin what should be the happiest day of your life." Richard's were coldly formal. "Your behavior tonight was unacceptable. I expect an apology before the wedding tomorrow." Not one of them acknowledged that they had done anything wrong. Not one of them apologized for attacking my father's memory. They were all focused on my reaction, rather than examining their own cruel behavior. Around midnight, there was a knock at my door. My heart jumped, thinking it might be Marcus finally coming to make things right. But when I looked through the peephole, it was just him standing there alone, looking frustrated rather than apologetic. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. "What do you want, Marcus?" "What do I want?" he repeated, sounding incredulous. "I want to know why you humiliated me and my family tonight. I want to know why you chose to cause a scene instead of talking to me privately about whatever was bothering you." I stared at him in disbelief. Even now, hours later, he still didn't understand what he'd done wrong. "What was bothering me?" I said slowly. "Marcus, your parents spent 15 minutes publicly trashing my father's memory, calling him presumptuous and meddlesome for helping your family. And you sat there and let them do it." "They weren't trashing him," Marcus insisted. "They were just sharing their perspective on what happened. Maybe it wasn't perfectly tactful, but you completely overreacted." "Their perspective?" My voice was rising again. "Their perspective on the man who co-signed a loan that saved your father's business? Their perspective on the man who spent his free time fixing your family's problems for free?" Marcus ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "Look, your dad was a nice guy, okay? But my parents aren't wrong that he sometimes got involved in things that weren't his business. Maybe he meant well, but—" "Stop," I said, holding up my hand. "Just stop talking." In that moment, I realized that this wasn't about his parents at all. This was about Marcus. He genuinely believed that my father had been meddlesome and inappropriate. He'd been listening to his parents' toxic opinions for who knows how long, and instead of defending the man who had helped his family, he'd adopted their ungrateful perspective. "You really believe what they said tonight, don't you?" I asked quietly. Marcus looked uncomfortable. "I think there's probably truth on both sides. Your dad was generous, but maybe he was also a little too eager to get involved in other people's problems." That was my answer. After 5 years together, Marcus saw my father's kindness and generosity as character flaws rather than virtues. He valued his parents' social status and opinions more than the man who had made much of their success possible. "Get out," I said quietly. "What?" "Get out of my apartment, Marcus. We're done." His eyes widened. "Sarah, you don't mean that. You're upset. But we can work through this. The wedding is tomorrow." "No," I said firmly. "There's no wedding tomorrow. I can't marry someone who thinks so little of my father and so little of me." "You're being ridiculous," Marcus said, his voice getting harder. "You're going to throw away 5 years over one dinner conversation? One dinner conversation where your family attacked my father's memory and you said nothing to defend him." I corrected. "One dinner conversation where you showed me exactly who you really are and what you really think of the values I was raised with." Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to decide whether to keep arguing or try a different approach. Finally, he sighed. "Fine," he said. "If this is how you want to handle it, I'll give you tonight to cool off. We can talk in the morning when you're thinking more clearly." "There won't be a morning conversation," I said. "And I am thinking clearly. Probably more clearly than I have in months." After Marcus left, I sat on my couch and stared at my wedding dress hanging in the closet. 24 hours ago, I'd been excited to put it on and walk down the aisle to marry the man I thought I loved. Now it looked like a costume for a play I no longer wanted to be in. Jake came out of the kitchen where he'd been giving me privacy for the conversation with Marcus. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I've been living a lie for the past year," I admitted. "Maybe longer. Dad always said that people show you who they really are eventually," Jake said gently. "It's just a matter of whether you're paying attention when they do." He was right. Marcus and his family had been showing me who they were for months, with their subtle digs and dismissive comments. I'd just been too invested in the idea of our future together to see it clearly. That night, I made the hardest decision of my life. There would be no wedding tomorrow. Instead, there would be honesty, self-respect, and the beginning of a new chapter that honored my father's memory, rather than compromising it for people who didn't deserve either of us. I woke up on what should have been my wedding day with a strange sense of peace. The sun was actually shining through my apartment windows, a rare October gift in Seattle, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. The decision to call off the wedding had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. My phone had been buzzing all morning with increasingly frantic messages from Marcus, Richard, and Catherine. The church was booked, the flowers were delivered, the guests were presumably getting ready to witness a ceremony that was never going to happen. But I felt no guilt about the chaos I was causing. They had brought this on themselves with their cruelty and arrogance. Jake knocked on my bedroom door around 10 a.m. "How are you holding up?" he asked, bringing me a cup of coffee. "Better than I expected," I admitted. "I keep waiting to feel devastated, but mostly I just feel free." "That's because you made the right choice," he said firmly. "Dad would be proud of you for standing up for yourself and for his memory." Around 11, there was a knock at my door. I assumed it would be Marcus making one last desperate attempt to salvage the wedding, but instead, it was Catherine, looking perfectly put together despite the crisis her family was facing. "Sarah, dear," she said with that fake, sweet smile. "May I come in? I think we need to have a conversation." Against my better judgment, I let her in. I was curious to see if she would finally acknowledge what they'd done wrong, or if this would be another attempt at manipulation. Catherine sat primly on my couch and looked around my modest apartment with barely concealed disdain. "This is quite a cozy little place," she said in a tone that made it clear she found it anything but cozy. "What do you want, Catherine?" I asked, not in the mood for small talk. "I want to save your relationship with my son," she said. "And I want to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life." I almost laughed. The biggest mistake of my life would be marrying into a family that has no respect for me or my father's memory. Catherine's mask slipped slightly. Your father's memory, she repeated with a slight edge to her voice. Sarah, you're a grown woman. You can't spend your entire life living in the shadow of a dead man. The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. A dead man? That dead man saved your husband's business. That dead man helped your family when no one else would. And we were grateful, Catherine said quickly. But David's help came with strings attached, didn't it? He used his generosity to insert himself into our family's business. He made us feel obligated to include him in decisions that should have been private. I stared at her in amazement. Even now, even after seeing the devastation their lies had caused, she was doubling down on her revisionist history of my father. There were no strings attached, I said coldly. Dad never asked for anything in return, never held his help over your heads, never demanded to be included in your decisions. The only obligation you felt was the basic human decency to be grateful, and apparently even that was too much for you. Catherine's composure was starting to crack. You have no idea what it was like, having someone from your background constantly involved in our affairs. Your father meant well, but he didn't understand boundaries. My background, I repeated. You mean working class? You mean honest people who help their neighbors without expecting anything in return? I mean people who don't understand their place, Catherine snapped, finally showing her true colors. Your father was a contractor, Sarah. A nice enough man, but he wasn't family. He wasn't part of our social circle. Yet he acted like he had the right to involve himself in our business decisions, our home renovations, our financial affairs. He had the right because you asked for his help. I shot back. Every single time. When your contractor botched your kitchen, you called Dad. When your mother needed her bathroom renovated, you asked Dad. When Richard needed that loan, you came to Dad. He didn't force himself on you. You sought him out because you knew he was competent and trustworthy. Catherine stood up abruptly, clearly frustrated that her manipulation tactics weren't working. Fine, she said, her voice turning icy. Let's be honest then. Your father was useful to us. He had skills we needed, and he was willing to work for free. But that doesn't mean we had to pretend he was our social equal. The mask was completely off now. This was who Catherine really was. Someone who saw my father as hired help rather than a generous neighbor. Someone who accepted his help gladly, but never saw him as worthy of basic respect. Get out, I said quietly. Sarah, be reasonable. Marcus loves you. Despite your background, you're never going to find another man from his caliber of family who's willing to overlook. Get out! I shouted, pointing toward the door. Get out of my apartment and don't ever come back. Catherine gathered her purse with wounded dignity. You're making a terrible mistake, she said. Marcus could have given you a life you never could have achieved on your own. The life I want to achieve is one where I'm surrounded by people who loved and respected my father the way he deserved, I replied. That obviously doesn't include your family. After Catherine left, I sat in my quiet apartment and felt the last of my doubts disappear. Her visit had been a gift in a way. It had shown me exactly what I would be signing up for if I married Marcus. A lifetime of subtle put-downs, social snobbery, and disrespect for everything my father had taught me about character and integrity. Around 2 p.m., the time when I should have been walking down the aisle, I got a text from Marcus. The church is full of people. Are you really going to humiliate me like this? I almost didn't respond, but then I realized I owed him one final explanation. I'm not humiliating you, I texted back. I'm saving us both from a marriage that would have been built on disrespect and incompatible values. You deserve someone who shares your family's perspective on what matters in life. And I deserve someone who would have defended my father's memory instead of sitting silent while your parents attacked it. His response came quickly. You're gonna regret this, Sarah. You're throwing away the best thing that ever happened to you. I looked around my small apartment, the same apartment Catherine had looked at with such disdain, and felt nothing but gratitude for my life. I had a job I enjoyed as a social worker, helping families navigate difficult situations. I had friends who supported me, and a brother who would always have my back. I had the memory of a father who had taught me that true wealth came from kindness, generosity, and treating people with dignity regardless of their social status. No, I texted back to Marcus. The best thing that happened to me was having David as my father. He taught me what real character looks like, and that's how I know you and your family don't have it. I blocked his number after sending that message. That evening, Tom came over with takeout from Dad's favorite Thai restaurant. We sat in my living room looking through old photo albums, and he told me stories about Dad that I'd never heard before. Your father always said, the measure of a person isn't how they treat their equals, Tom said, pointing to a picture of Dad teaching some neighborhood kids how to use basic tools. It's how they treat people who can't do anything for them in return. Richard and Catherine failed that test spectacularly, I said. They did, Tom agreed. But you passed it with flying colors when you stood up for his memory last night. 3 weeks later, I received a package in the mail. Inside was my father's watch, a simple Timex he'd worn every day for 20 years, along with a note from Marcus. Found this in my apartment. Thought you might want it back. I held the watch in my hands and felt the weight of everything it represented. Dad had worn this watch while building homes for young families, while volunteering at community fundraisers, while helping the neighbors with their endless projects. It had timed thousands of acts of kindness and generosity. I strapped it onto my wrist and made a promise to myself and to Dad's memory. I would never again let anyone make me feel ashamed of where I came from or the values I was raised with. I would never again stay silent while people I loved were attacked by those who should have been grateful for their help. 6 months later, I ran into Marcus at a coffee shop downtown. He was with a woman I didn't recognize, someone who looked like she would fit perfectly into his parents' social circle. She was wearing designer clothes and expensive jewelry, everything Catherine had probably wanted in a daughter-in-law. Marcus saw me and approached hesitantly. "Sarah," he said awkwardly, "how are you?" "I'm good," I said, and I meant it. "Really good." He glanced at the woman waiting for him by the counter. "That's Amanda," he said. We're engaged." "Congratulations," I said sincerely. "I hope you'll be very happy together." He looked surprised by my genuine response. "I thought you might be, I don't know, upset." "Why would I be upset?" I asked. "You found someone who shares your values and your family's perspective on what matters. That's what you needed." Marcus studied my face, looking for signs of bitterness or regret, but he wouldn't find any. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we'd worked things out?" I thought about that night at the Metropolitan, about his silence while his parents attacked my father's memory, about his inability to understand why their behavior was wrong. "No," I said honestly, "I don't. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And I was. I was living a life that honored my father's memory, surrounded by people who shared his values of kindness, integrity, and genuine care for others. I had learned that real love doesn't ask you to compromise your core principles or stay silent while the people you care about are attacked. As I watched Marcus return to Amanda, I felt nothing but gratitude for that terrible rehearsal dinner. It had been painful, but it had also been necessary. It had shown me who Marcus really was, and saved me from a lifetime of trying to fit into a world that would never truly accept me or the values my father had instilled in me. I walked out of that coffee shop with Dad's watch on my wrist and his lessons in my heart, ready to build a life worthy of the man who had raised me to never settle for less than I deserved.